Sounds good to me.
So Andrew is an official Olympus mentor, a full-time professional ecologist and conservationist, and has had his fair share of experience with tiny creatures, over 30 years, in fact. He doesn't look old enough, guys, does he? Definitely doesn't look old enough. His work is absolutely brilliant and no wonder. His philosophy is to use his work to highlight the beauty and complexity of the natural world and to raise awareness of the fragility of our environment in a period of unprecedented change. Specialising in nature photography and especially insect macro photography, I give you Andrew, who is going to talk to us about macro focus stacking.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rebecca. I'll just share my screen and tell me whether you can see it. Can you?
We can, yes.
You can see that. Fantastic. Good. Okay. I'm going to have to rattle through this, aren't I? Because I appreciate I've got a relatively short amount of time and I do love to talk. Okay, guys, what I'm going to give you today is, and it's very much a sketchy overview, so I apologize for not going into an enormous amount of detail, but essentially it's an introduction to macro focus stacking, which is a subject which has become increasingly popular in the last few years because camera technology is changing and it's becoming easier to do. Okay, so I wanted to really start by, well, looking at a really fundamental question. Why do we want to stack? What's wrong with conventional macro photography? Well, anybody who's tried photographing really close up or with telephoto photography of insects will know that they've got depth of field problems, and this image illustrates it quite well. This is a common data, and you can see how I've got the plane of focus really nailed here. The whole body of the insect is in focus, but the wings are out of focus. In fact, even on the stem it's sitting on, you can see that it's starting to drift out in the front, and that just shows you how what a tight depth of field you're working with very often. Well, of course, you can compromise. We can use the exposure triangle. We can up our ISO, but that could potentially mean that you're going to lose a degree of detail or get a little bit of noise creeping in. And of course, there are shutter speed issues if we don't do that. So we've got this conundrum with macro, this limitation that means that it's very difficult to get the entire image in focus. The other issue is, of course, background control. If you stop down, if we're working at f16, even f22 potentially, though you may be drifting into diffusion territory there, the lens may start getting soft. But we start to struggle with our background starting to become in focus, and unless you're working with a background that's a long distance away, you start getting clutter coming in, so you affect the composition. So stacking is something which I've been doing for a few years. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, and I appreciate there will be some who have tried it with varying degrees of success. There may be some experts here, but there will also be some who don't really understand it and don't know what it is. So this is a schematic I've put together just to give you a flavor for a quick overview, if you will. So essentially what you're trying to do is to take a series of slices, overlapping slices with a small depth of field through an image. And you can see here this shot of a flower. I've chosen a front focus point that I've focused on. And then I've got a series of, I think, 22 images to a rear focus point somewhere up here. And then I've stacked these together using stacking software. And I'll come on to the techniques I've used to get these shots in a minute. Processed them in stacking software, ended up with this really rather nice image with the whole thing beautifully in focus from front to back. That's essentially all stacking is. It's not terribly difficult or complex to get your head round. It's a series, as I say, of overlapping slices with a narrow depth of field to build up a bigger depth of field. Now, we can do this, and I'm going to talk about two approaches to this. We can do this in the field with insects or other species, plants or fungi, in the field using a variety of techniques, and we can do it in the studio too. And I'm going to be looking at both approaches to that in this introduction. Okay, Stacking in the field. What do I use? This is purely personal choice, but the system of choice for me is the Olympus OMD system. It's micro four thirds. I also shoot Sony. I have a Sony full frame, so I'm not slavishly wedded to the Olympus system. But I do find for certain types of photography, it's brilliant. And for macro photography, for me, particularly given this little fellow, which is the 60mm macro lens. It's tiny and it goes in a pocket. It's very, very sharp. This is the lens on the left-hand side. It's a brilliant piece of kit. My other lens of choice, I guess, is this one, which is a telephoto, the 4150 Olympus, and they can both be used for stacking with the Olympus EM1 series, the EM5 and the EM10 series. I have a tripod that has an adjustable top. This is a Vanguard Alta Pro tripod, which means I can get down to ground level. And then I've got a number of other bits and pieces that I usually have in my bag. A couple of these things, clamps, which are used for stabilizing my subjects, because obviously what you don't want while you're taking a stack through a subject is to have the subject moving. A second tripod, I normally carry a short travel tripod, which I find is a really, really good way of stabilizing the subjects because I have the plant clamp attached to it. A remote release, pair of secateurs, and if I'm not carrying a flash, which I often do, but if I'm not carrying a flash, I'll use a reflector to bounce a little bit of light back into the subject to ramp up that shutter speed a little bit more. Now, I talked about working in the field with various types of technique. There's three really I want to look at. The first is manually shifting focus. And this shot here of a spider is one of the first I ever took using this manual approach. And this very happily for me won the British Wildlife Photography Awards macro category a couple of years ago. And you can see here the beginnings of the focus point and the end focus point. I focused somewhere around here to get the front of this spider, which was sitting at sort of 45 degrees to me, and then focused through manually until I'd got to this rear point. Now, what do I mean by manually? Well, I had it was a Canon system in those days, a Canon 5D Mark IV locked down on a heavy tripod with their manual 180 macro lens. You could do the same with this lens, I guess, but essentially all I was doing, very simple, and this is something anyone can do, even if they don't have a specialist kit, is literally just winding the barrel of the lens forward a millimeter at a time and taking a shot, winding it, taking a shot, winding it, taking a shot, until my focus point had traveled all the way through to the rear point. Well, as you can see, it worked a treat. It did take 4 or 5 stacks to produce one stack where the subject was completely in alignment, and I was very lucky. I had a very receptive subject on the day. The spider was stationary, there was no wind, and it was a beautiful bright overcast day, which meant the light was perfect. This was taken using a manual focusing rail. For those of you who have never seen a manual focusing rail, it's essentially this. It's a device whereby you lock the camera on a tripod with a focusing rail above it, and instead of winding the lens barrel, you literally wind a dial on the side of the focusing rail, which shifts the manually focused lens forwards and backwards, and it does exactly the same job as on the previous shot. And as you can see, the advantage is that you're not restricted to a tiny sliver of depth of field. You've got a full spider in focus, and you've got a lovely out of focus background, which works really well. The third option is the automated stacking function, and the reason that I enjoy shooting the Olympus for macro is because it's got a really very, very fast automated stacking function, which with a little bit of trial and error, a little bit of practice, produces shots like this, even on a windy day. And that for me has been a game changer, because in the past, manual stacking, which is what I did a couple of years ago before I started shooting Olympus, was a little bit of a hit or miss affair with any kind of movement of the subject or wind movement. You could be sure that the stack would fail. Now I can run the stack very quickly, and I'll come on to the technique for that in a minute. There's a couple of approaches you could use. You could use what I've got here, which is an electronic focusing rail. This is the stack shot from Cognisys. but it's a fairly hefty, cumbersome beast, all right for working in the studio. But for me, I'm fairly lazy. I couldn't be bothered to carry it around with me because you need a battery to go along with it, and all sorts of wires and other gizmos, as if carrying, you know, a camera bag and all your peripherals for macro photography wasn't bad enough. Anyway, I use the Olympus, and Olympus is obviously not the only camera that has this kind of function. Now, I believe Nikon have had the D850 was their first camera, I think, that had a stacking function built in. Panasonic have had it for a while, and I believe that certainly the new Nikon mirrorless cameras and the new Canon mirrorless cameras also have an inbuilt stacking function. So, you know, people are they're catching up with Olympus, but Olympus have had this system in place since 2016, and it's very easy to use. So the automated stacking function with Olympus is essentially there's two approaches to this. There's what they call bracketing and focus stacking. I don't use the focus stacking function because I find that, well, for various reasons, which I don't really have time to go into today, it has its limitations, and it produces a JPEG final stacked output, which could be quite useful, I guess, if you wanted to share the image without too much processing. But personally, I prefer to have much more control over my focus stacking. So I shoot using their bracketing function, and this is achieved by going into their shooting menu 2 on the Olympus EM1 Mark III, choosing bracketing, choosing focus bracketing, and then setting these parameters, which is the focus differential, which is essentially the distance between each slice of image that you take. And a focus differential of 10 would give you a large difference, and a focus bracketing a differential of say 3 would give you a much smaller distance. Now for insects, I tend to shoot at 3 because I find that gives me just about the right amount when I'm shooting at around f5.6, and that wide aperture means I can diffuse that background, as you can see here with this shot of the same dragonfly that I showed you earlier, which has its wings pointing forward probably an inch ahead of the body, and you can see how well it's controlled the depth of field with this stack of about 25 images. And with the focus bracketing on Olympus, you get to shoot amazingly up to 9,999 images. I can't think why you'd ever want to do that, but you know, hey, you may. This is the kind of results you can get. This is an elephant hawk moth, and as you can see, with conventional macro, it would be impossible to do this, although it looks very natural in my view. The insect is beautifully in focus. The perch is also beautifully in focus, and the background is out of focus nicely. The same is true of this poplar hawk, where the perch is out of focus. In focus. The background is out of focus, but nicely controlled. And of course, with stacking, you can experiment with different apertures to get the effect you want, knowing your subject will still be in focus. And the insect is beautifully in focus. This was taken on a very windy day. This is a pair of Chalk Hill blue butterflies at a site in Somerset, and impossible several years ago doing it manually. And this is really where the Olympus shows its speed, because when you set focus bracketing on the Olympus, it's essentially an automated system. As soon as you hit the shutter button, once you've found the front focus point, it fires a series of images through the subject, and this was taken in less than a second. It shot 15-20 images in less than a second. The Olympus system is very fast. That's where I find it very useful. So on a windy day, you can wait till the subject is stabilized and then hit shutter button, and then it will fire the shots, and hopefully you've got a stack in focus. Now, I mentioned that I also do studio stacking. This is a winter thing for me, and this is taking advantage of this mad-looking lens, which is a 2.5 to 5 times life-size macro lens, essentially an ultra macro lens. And this is my studio setup, which I have on a double focusing rail, which I'll explain. I fire flash. My illumination is solely flash, using a flash trigger that sits on top of the camera. This is the lower 2.5 to 5 times ultra macro lens, which I've just shown you. I've got a cheap relatively. It's about 250 quid. WeMacro is a Chinese company, focusing rail, which I found to be really, really good. It's got a nice Android-based or iPhone-based control interface, wireless, so really easy to use with only 1 or 2 parameters. I set a mechanical focusing rail on top only because I've got one. I don't need to, but it does mean that I find it very easy then to find the front point of the stack in order to run the stack through. Now, I should say when you're shooting, and this puts some people off, when you're shooting studio macro photography of insects, you're of necessity, you're going to be shooting dead bugs, aren't you? Now, I'm lucky as an ecologist. I've been carrying out surveys of various fauna and flora for about 30 years, and in that time I've built up a pretty big collection of bugs. When we survey sites, we need to do this because we often need to identify species, and unfortunately for some insects, the only way of doing that and thereby determining their conservation requirements is to take a sample and then to dissect it. So I've got a big boxes full of these things, some of them 25, 30 years old. And having done this for some time and having learned how to curate insects or insect specimens, it's meant that I was able to shortcut what is quite a difficult skill to learn. And so I was able to do my pinning and setting and to produce photographs like this rather than some hunched up, crunched up, dried insect that you found on your windowsill. I also bag bag insects when they die on the windowsill before my wife gets a chance to hoover them up, and I've taken some good photographs as a consequence. This is the setup, and you can see a bug here there circled with the lower lens there, ultra macro lens, extended to about 4.5 to 1. This little device on the end is a lighting ring. It's not a flash, it's a permanent illumination, and it enables me to really see exactly where the front focus point is. This is the setup with flash, and you can see I've got a kind of homemade diffuser here sitting on top. Diffusion is a real problem. I mean, this is a problem with lighting insects generally. Insects are very shiny, so you've got to really heavily diffuse the insects so you don't get high amount of reflectivity and burned out highlights. It can be a problem with flash, particularly with extreme macro, where the flashes are low powered and very, very close to the subject. I've got clamps here that I use in the field, but I also use those to hold the diffusers in place. And a couple of flexible arms. Manfrotto makes some good stuff to hold flash units. And this is the little ring light that I was talking about earlier, and it comes with that lens. This is the kind of result you can get if your control of lighting and your post-processing is good. This is a composite of about 100 images of a feathered thorn moth, the head of a feathered thorn moth taken at about ×3 life size. It can be, a quite spectacular and really enjoyable way of taking pictures. And if you go in really close, and this is ×5, this is the side of just a domestic housefly, one of the ones my wife hadn't hoovered up, I expect. And you can see the kind of detail you can get. They really do become alien-like and really rather beautiful when you get that close. Now, I want to talk about the processing side of things, because this is equally true whether you're taking stacking images in the field or whether you're doing it in the studio. And now there are lots of stacking software approaches. I've got a couple I use. This is Helicon Focus. This is the interface of Helicon Focus, which is an off-the-shelf dedicated stacking program that you can use, import your photos and then run the stack. Or you can use something like Xerine Stacker. You can use Photoshop, and there are numerous free pieces of software on the market which are, I'm told, very good, but I'm familiar with this. I find it incredibly intuitive and easy to use. And essentially all it is, you can see I've imported my images from the stack here on the right. This is one of the images, this top one here. So you can see it's got hardly any depth of field. There are my other images down here. Basic menu, which I mostly only use the file and import. And then you've got a series of what they call rendering methods, and these are the algorithms that the computer uses to stitch all these overlapping images together. And I'm going to show you very quickly how it works, because it's really quite impressive. I'm hoping this will work, actually, because I did have it set up as a video. Yes, here we are. I'm just going to run this, and you can see how the rendering method works, because it's quite graphic. So just bear with me a second. And you can see it here building up the image as the stack runs. This is speeded up. But there you are. You can see, if I zoom in slightly, that you've got a fully in focus picture of a head-on shot of an elephant hawk moth. So really quite an impressive, very, very easy to use piece of software, I have to say. That stack, to run that stack, took me 2 or 3 minutes. Very, very easy to do. The reason I said I like to use a manual approach is because very often, particularly when you're using high magnifications and you're doing studio work, you end up with these really odd out of focus artifacts, which can take a lot of processing. And I haven't done this for about a year. I tend to do it in sort of December, January, when I've got, when I'm not doing much in the field wildlife photography. But you can see some of the problems that you get with these blurring images or issues around the edges. And I usually do most of my cleanup work in Lightroom using one of the adjustment brushes, where essentially what you're doing is copying the black pixels, if I'm using a black background here, into the areas to remove these artifacts, and then I'll follow that up with work in Photoshop. And it can take time, but this is the result. This is how how you should aim to get it. But you can see the exquisite detail that's been rendered on the head of this grasshopper here, and this is the final image after having cleaned it up in Photoshop. And it can take time, but it's well worth it. A lot of people think these are ugly critters, but I think the natural world revealed close up like that is extraordinary. One of the other problems you have, and I've particularly got this with old specimens, is dust. And you can see this inset here in the corner of a pond skater, how much dust there was on this old specimen of about 25 years old that was sampled during some pond surveys. And I've cleaned this up in Photoshop meticulously and slowly, but the result is quite spectacular. This head-on shot of a bug, you would never get to see it like this in real life, unless you were tiny, and in which case you probably wouldn't last long, as it was a predatory species. But these are the kinds of things you can play around, that you can do. You can play around with colored backgrounds. Got a moth, a noctuid moth on the left-hand side here, and a good old blue bottle on the right. You can play around with colored backgrounds, and because we're working at high mag, I can use things like post-it notes. Are really good, and you can even put them together to form graduated backgrounds. Or you can use a pure black background. It's probably easier. And I would want to say here, although some of these were taken with 35, with 35 mil full frame equivalent, usually the Canons, you can equally shoot very, very acceptable ultra macro images with micro four thirds. This was taken with the Olympus. This is a giant horsefly, so you can see it's a fun thing to do. So anybody who's interested, contact me. I'm always keen to help people. I do run one-to-ones, and if I can help you either in the field or in setting up a studio, I'll be very happy to help you. So on that note, I think that is the last image. I just wanted to summarize, if I may, over this shot of a wing of a moth. So firstly, stacking enables a greater depth of field to be obtained. You can get better control of your backgrounds, so your photographs become a more impactful, better composition. You can shoot either manual or automated, as I hope I've demonstrated today. You need to work at controlling subject movement, because if you get any kind of misalignment, you can have a problem making the stack work. And you do need to ensure the steps overlap each other, otherwise you'll have banding within the image, which can look unsightly. And finally, I would say your processing can be time consuming, particularly for the ultra macro work, where it can take sometimes days, but it can be very, very rewarding. And as I say, finally, it can be highly addictive. So on that note, I'm going to hand you back to Rebecca, if I may. I'm going to stop sharing, and Rebecca, thank you very much.
Thank you. That was absolutely fabulous. Thank you so much. We
Pleasure.
have a few questions for you. So, with photographing dragonflies in the field, for example, they don't hang around for long. Do you have any?
No. What do you do? How do you get pictures of dragonflies? Is that what you want to know?
Basically, yeah.
Patience and going out on the right day in the right weather is really helpful, because if you go out on a very warm day, yes, they can be really difficult to get close to. But if you go out on a cooler day when they're perched up, you can be lucky. The best days for macro work generally are bright overcast, but not too hot. And so it's really a question of watching the weather forecast. So Mr. BBC, I find, or Mr. AccuWeather. So cooler days, low wind, where you haven't got subjects waving around or moving around. And actually, even then, you can sometimes get lucky. But yeah, it can be hard work.
Yes. Steve, who has asked the question, you are a member of ours, aren't you? So you'll have to catch up on Andrew's, if you haven't seen it already, the webinar that Andrew's already done for us, because you give loads of advice. Then, didn't you, as well?
Yeah.
So that's one for you, Steve, to catch up on. And if you aren't a guild member already, I'll post another referral link that you can use so that you can join us and get access to all of those fantastic webinars. But for now, oh, one more question before we let you go. What do you think about macro ring lights?
I would never use them, but I have used them actually. No, I tell a lie, but not for about 40 years. I used to use them for macro flash photography when I was shooting film. They're very good. They can be very good. They can give a very flat light, which can be good, but it can also be quite difficult to get surface texture with. You tend to lose that fine detail sometimes, but they can be very effective. Yeah, I wouldn't. Modern ones are better than they used to be. So yeah, I wouldn't knock them. They can be great.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
For questions. It's been a pleasure to have you on again, and we look forward to working with you more in the future.
Absolutely, Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So